Once CIBC announced their acquisition of our firm in January 2018, every single Canadian bank of any size all tried to either start over or go and build their own teams.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the BetaKit podcast. I am Douglas Saltis, editor-in-chief of BetaKit, and my co-host Rob Kennedy is still off recovering from Startup Fest. Now, we've had quite a few VCs as guests on this podcast recently, and there's a reason for that. You like hearing what they have to say. But that can sometimes create the perception that what VCs are telling you is 100% what's going down. And frankly, there are simply more perspectives that inform the Canadian tech stack. So today we're talking to Mark McQueen, President and Executive Managing Director for CIBC Innovation Banking. Now, CIBC does business with VCs, but also their LPs and portfolio investments. So Mark has perhaps a broader perspective on the current state of tech on both sides of the border. But that broad perspective has some depth behind it too. McQueen joined CIBC through its acquisition of Wellington Financial in 2018. So he saw the dot-com bubble burst, the impact of the 2008 financial crisis on tech, the recent explosion of capital, and the post-COVID downturn/market correction. It's a lot of perspective to provide on how circumstances are changing, not just for founders, but VCs and LPs. And we talk about all of that on the podcast. But there was one question that Mark wasn't prepared for. One I just had to ask. Just why exactly he had to hang up his blog, which was popular amongst Bay Street and Canadian tech long before there was a BetaKit. The answer may surprise you. Let's dig in. Okay, Mark, thank you so much for joining us. I think probably for our people listening, they've had a lot of VCs on this podcast, and VCs say VC things. You have a kind of an interesting history here with not only CIBC, but Wellington Financial. So I think we maybe want to start with you giving us a bit of a background on how you got to be at CIBC and how Wellington was involved. And I think that's going to be a really good prompt for us to kind of trace the history of what's been happening in this ecosystem for the last couple of years. Everyone's acting as if the sky is falling, and I feel it's because they haven't seen the sky fall before.
And don't even appreciate how high the sky was last year and think this is somewhat too low when, of course, it's still very high relative to the last 20 years.
Certainly. So which is a roundabout way of saying that you've been around this ecosystem for a while, but that's also the reason why we want to have you on the podcast. So we can start with Wellington to CIBC, but start wherever you want in that regard.
Well, the reason why I think this current window is interesting is because it feels to me a lot like the summer and winter of 2000. So Wellington Financial started out as a hobby. We did our first deal in August of 2000. It was $500,000 deal for a company in British Columbia. And after a few years and 5 deals on a $7 million fund, decided to make it a business and raised external capital in 2003, 2004, and launched Fund 2 in 2004 with $83 million. But when you have $7 million and it's the summer of 2000 and the NASDAQ has peeled off 60% or something, and it looked like the world was going to end permanently in technology and life science and clean tech and what have you, both public and private markets, that was a very bleak outlook. And for good reason. Limited partners who just entered the sector late felt burned. And if you had been around in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, you would have made a lot of money as a pension plan or an institutional investor. But if you came in the summer of 99 and your LP-GP relationship did its thing and a bunch of money went out the door and you felt totally like you were trying to catch the falling knife, which always hurts your hand. So we started doing bridge lending then, 6-month deals at the time, and golly, the market would have contracted on the venture side, certainly over half. Many funds that raised in 2000, 2002 never raised again in Canada, and certainly after 2004, Ventures West, names like that, who'd raised 8 funds. So part of what I think people need to think about now, both entrepreneurs and institutions, is to keep that in mind. Certainly when we look at companies today, I'm reminded of what it was like, just how bleak it was in that summer of 2000. And, you can play through that as an investor and as an entrepreneur and as a VC and bank's case. So Wellington, great time to have a checkbook. You get to pick and choose, who you want to work with, what deal sizes you want to do. No pressure to put out capital, much like 2009. There was no pressure to put out capital because your limited partners felt the same way you did, right? Gosh golly gee, is going to be a 3-year recession, a 5-year recession, a 6-month recession coming with the financial crisis. And a lot of folks sat on their hands at that time. And, I think the nadir of venture investment in the US that year was $17.9 billion, let's say. You think about last year, it was $330 billion that was invested in the US venture ecosystem. If that number gets cut in half, if that number gets cut by 2/3, we think about just how bad it was in '09, it's still fantastic. So having that historical appreciation for what post dot-com bubble and what '09 looks like, hopefully gives entrepreneurs some resolve to stick to it, period.
Honestly, I think that answer is probably one of the reasons demonstrated why we want to have you on. Now, I have a couple questions related to that as to whether or not even people are paying attention to those times or if they're rapidly looking to purchase a venture history book to correlate that, because I don't feel like many people were in the market at that time.
And that's fair. I think that's part of the problem is you're going to have a generation of people who didn't have to witness that, and no fault of theirs, and now they are facing the same decisions that I think institutional investors faced in 2000.
Yeah. Now, interesting. You said is getting started in 2000. I believe, having read your blog, which we'll get to later, that I think you started without a business card or a website at that time. Fast forward to 2018, and then CIBC comes a knocking. What was the process of being on the other side of the deal, I guess, and being acquired in that regard to basically, if correct me if I get this wrong, but to like help buttress and or build CIBC's innovation banking team through your acquisition?
Look, we had raised 5 funds by then, and we're about to raise Fund 6. The Fund 5 had a $900 million capacity. It was a recirculating vehicle, 10 years, 2 and 20 structure. Nobody is stupid enough to give up the 2 and 20 structure, as we all know. And things were great. You do 10 deals a year. You focus on doing really good deals and help those companies grow and work with the VCs to succeed and handle folks who have hiccups. And it's a great business. Went to the United States in '09, having done just Canadian deals. The tax laws changed in '09, so withholding tax went at the border for interest income, and so you could compete in Boston the same as in Montreal. And you didn't know when you showed up in California with a venture debt checkbook if anybody would care. And lo and behold, people did. They were interested. We had a 5-year product, no amortization for 5 years, and it was industry leading. And we did a lot of great deals. And about 85% of our business was U.S. based VC-backed companies. By the time the bank acquired our firm, and offices in San Francisco, Santa Monica, and New York at the end, plus Toronto. The process was, CIBC had been looking at the ecosystem, had tried to do organic strategy, didn't really know what a good deal looked like, which is totally normal if you don't have experience in the sector. You see 5 companies, one of them looks the best of 5, but is that the right deal to do? And so they approached us and they asked for some advice and talked about what they're trying to accomplish, and we tried to help them with some ideas and some places to focus. And then they came back after 6 months and said, this is a really good idea, but it'd be a lot easier if we acquired the firm. And I said, all right, what does that mean? And who does the business plan? And they said, well, you do that. Who does risk management? And I said, well, your team should do that. I said, who will work on portfolio management, and who will handle the companies that are not doing great? We don't want to hand them off to a special loans unit and who isn't experienced and doesn't know the people and the players. And they said, well, you folks are great at that, so please do that too. So that was interesting. And most importantly, Canada did not have a domestic champion in the sector. Foreign banks had been in Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto for 20 or 30 years, doing briefcase lending, and Canadian banks were able to lend to a lobster fisherman against the lobster fisherman's license, but they couldn't lend to a cash negative software company in Waterloo with 10 million of revenue. And that's kind of crazy, and yet it's true. Well, one Canadian bank had a knowledge-based industry group for 20 years. There wasn't a whole lot of cash flow negative lending going on. There was a lot of deposit gathering and branding, but not a lot of lending, pure lending, venture lending. So I thought that'd be fun. It was hard. We weren't doing, and if it worked, well, then my kids someday would be able to go to a Canadian bank, and if they were entrepreneurs in the life science or tech space, and be able to borrow money. And wouldn't that be a great thing after 150 years or 200 years of Canadian banking tradition? Very, very good Canadian banking tradition, but this one part of the market that wasn't being well served locally. So that was the appeal, and so giving up obviously all of the luxury and the burden of managing a fund and doing all that certainly was a change, but it's worked out great.
It's interesting. You're connecting some of the things. It's crazy but true. I think could be applied to most sectors of history, but certainly the Canadian tech sector. To bring it to present day, there was a couple of things that you were explaining to me before about how the market was responding in, say, 2000, 2001 that compared to now. Limited partners who entered the sector late feeling a bit of a pinch. But if you had been in early, it was a great time to have a checkbook. And the pressure to put out capital had diminished because your LPs were feeling the same way. A lot of that rings true to right now, except for a few things that I want to get into. But one VC I was speaking to in preparation for this interview was saying that your business has changed more than the VC business in the past 5 years, particularly in Canada, because of the explosion of debt lenders coming into the space, way more competition from a variety of different types. I think we're seeing, in addition to CIBC, a couple of the big five Canadian banks making some inroads into this space.
All of them are once CIBC announced their acquisition of our firm in January 2018, every single Canadian bank of any size all tried to either start over or go and build their own teams and go to town. And that's good. I mean, I anybody who thinks that's a bad thing misunderstood my earlier point, which is the appeal to me in part was to create a domestic champion. And if we wind up helping to spawn 3 or 4 domestic champions, well, then that's all the better for the economy and our country. And there's enough business to go around.
It's interesting because I would certainly wasn't presenting that as a negative, but just
I'll take it as a compliment.
Yeah, there's certainly enough deals to go around. That sentiment I think is a new one because I a little bit of a Canadian big fish small pond syndrome. I think it's been mostly here about if you could get the access to capital, it's about kind of winning the deal. And I'm wondering if you can help me connect the state of play from both sides here, from your business on the innovation banking and lending side, but then also let's go VC all the way down to founder, because it being a great time to have a checkbook and having no pressure to deploy capital sounds great from one end. But if you're a founder listening to this podcast, you are freaking out because all you've been reacting to in the last 2 years has been the pressure to deploy capital, shotgunning money into your business from not only on this side of the border, but south of the border.
And globally. That's
yeah, right. I don't know if the last 2 years, I think one of the things you're basically trying to connect is even though we've seen a dramatic dip in the last year, we're still kind of on trend for where we were 2018, 2019. We've kind of returned to that normalized growth rate.
And nobody was whining then about there not being enough capital to go around, right?
No, I think some people were whining. There was a lot of people when it came to. I don't think that everyone had a great relationship with their banking partner, and I don't think.
Oh, that's a different point. Yeah, no, that's a different point. That's totally. I was thinking on the equity side, but look, you're right. In the last 5 years, obviously, people have gone from perhaps having to go and knock on a door of a bank to now finding banks calling them and going to conferences and seeing lots of commercial banks there, both domestic and otherwise, and that's good. I think where you're going is what does this mean today for newer entrants? A bunch of money's come into the sector, as you said. A bunch of funds have been created, more competition than ever. That's true on the debt side. I think the challenge for the new players is going to be that they don't know what this means for the business that they just built. They have a handful of relationships. They've got a portfolio they've just constructed in the last 36 months or something. They thought they did the right deals, as everybody does at closing. And now there's this dramatic drop in valuations, right? E-commerce companies down 60%, let's say, and SaaS companies off 50 or more percent. And what does this mean? And that is, of course, if you have a short history in a sector and it peels off, it's going to be scary. And there's going to be risk management teams across the street who are going to be mortified that this is just like the telecom bust in late 90s, and this is just like the yada yada.
Every
And
last major Canadian failing that they only remember.
and Gulf Petroleum and and all that stuff and oh by the why we're in the sector anyway, it's such a small part of our overall balance sheet, and why we're doing this and whose idea was this, and all those things. And that, I think we'll see in 2 or 3 or 4 years who's got the stomach and the strategic desire to be in the sector, and CIBC certainly does, and that's why our CEO Richard Dodig talks about it every earnings call and an investor conference in June, as a growth engine for the bank, because there's 6,000 banks in North America, and there's maybe a dozen that do any form of tech lending well. That's a great place to be.
So you still think the opportunity is right, but I'm more interested in, like, obviously having the backing of one of Canada's major banks and the commitment there is helpful. Do you see any, like, you're talking about some of the other potential competitors in the space, whether there be kind of pension backed or not pension backed, some of the emergent entrants? I had one person, I think, sarcastically ask me, just to see how you would react, how you're different from Clearbank or Clearco now, I guess. There's a variety of capital options now available to startups. Let's put it that way. Do you see any among those different bands of where that capital is coming from and their maybe incentives for why they're lending? Do you see any tier of those lenders really starting to struggle, or do you think it's just a matter of, as you're saying, like, commitment to the bit?
First of all, you have to, if you had all the information that existed in the world about any firm in our sector, whether it's venture capital or venture lending, business model, start there. What is the business model? And how sustainable is that? How sustainable is the capital? Are they using leverage, or is all the capital coming, from their own balance sheet, so to speak, right? So at Wellington, we didn't use leverage. All of our capital was equity from pension plans, life insurance companies, and institutional investors, and Clairvest Group on a 10-year structure, right? That money would be there next year. That's different than any fund who's raised $1 in equity and has gone and raised $1 in debt, for example, and then goes out and lends $2. Half that capital isn't there. So you have to look at structure, business model, and then you've got to ask yourself pretty simple questions around go-to-market strategy. What verticals are they after? And you've heard about royalty schemes the last 20 years. They're gone, right? There's public companies at TSX that were royalty schemes and in the tech space, and geez, it didn't work out, because if you thought about the business model for more than 5 minutes, you would see the flaws and how unsustainable it is at scale. Any business in the debt space can last forever, as long as they've got modest aspirations and they've got a modest amount of capital and they've got some expertise. And the challenge is scaling a business and maintaining that over cycles. And we did that at Wellington over 18 years. And Preqin, the UK-based global analyst of hedge funds and debt funds and VC funds, that tracks all the return data, whatever, had 140 corporate debt funds of various strategies they tracked over the course of our time in the business. And we ranked in the top decile for returns for any fund that had at least three live funds in history, which is a good number to kind of track how the team does over consecutive offerings. And the new entrants to the space who've got an angle, who were able to capitalize on our robust equity market and both getting money themselves, raising it from investors, and then putting it out into companies at a time when no one was going bankrupt because they're between the COVID capital that came from governments, the funding there, plus the equity market. Now's the time where people's business models will be tested. And if you had it right and you had an experienced bunch of people who had their own money at risk, you should be good.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's dig into it. I really want to talk about kind of the business model, but also like your relationship to your customers. Let's put it that way from that framing, because you have different touch points here. But I'm wondering how much of this is impacted just by the fact that you're one of the lenders that's actually able to offer banking services to startups, and if that is a net add, because you look at someone like SVB in the space, like they can't provide any banking services in Canada. From the other side of that coin, most Canadian startups, if you ask them about the banking services that are offered to zero revenue venture-backed businesses, they're absolutely pretty awful. And some of our most popular stories are about startups in the fintech space trying to piece together competitive offerings there because most small business owners or entrepreneurs don't get the level of service that they're hoping for. Do you wrap that into the model? Do you see that as a specific advantage that because you're backed by CIBC now, you can offer kind of like a whole spectrum of products or things, or do you just hand that off to the next team?
No. Yes is the answer. Part of the irony at Wellington was, your best clients would outgrow you, right? Your best clients would get refied by a senior lender down the road when the business model worked. And one of the appeals of the CIBC transaction was that we would get to grow with our clients and our best clients. And so you get into a 5 million revenue company, and then when they get to 105, you're able to grow with them. And that's why our strategy is intentionally at CIBC, early, mid, late, right? Single digit revenue, Series A companies who obviously are in burn mode. And then for the late stage pre-IPO companies who need heft and balance sheet and experience and speed, we can serve each profile. And that's fun, and it's enjoyable for the team. And each entrepreneur knows going in that first meeting that we can be there forever. Our Expensify, the CEO of Expensify, a company in Portland, called CIBC a partner for life, and I'll take that any day. If an entrepreneur comes to us in Saskatoon and needs a $1.7 million revolver to go along with the Series A round, we want to do that business. We can help them grow their business. If they need a mortgage for their team, we can help people with that kind of stuff. When you're building a business and you've got 5 or 25 or 35 staff, there's a whole bunch of your life you don't have time for, right? That personal side of your life, there's no time. And one of the luxuries of the bank platform is that we get to take care of entrepreneurs, not just with capital in their business and not just with relationship connections to VCs or whatnot, but also on the personal side where they get that kind of attention from the local private banker because they're a client of ours. And what a great way to distinguish yourself in an ecosystem. And also they need it because frankly, each of us at that stage of our lives needs a mortgage or someone to help us through those kinds of things and tax planning or whatever. And it's a really appealing part of why folks come to us, and also what we enjoy doing just to help entrepreneurs.
Does CIBC or any of the other banks, do you kind of require those startups to start doing banking services with you now, or is that kind of like you just put together a preferred vendor offering? And
look, if you want to go public with a competing institution, so be it. We are not in the tight selling business. What we are able to do is provide a holistic relationship to folks who need it, and you know what, it's really worked well.
Hey CTOs, are you endlessly building your app or website, leaving you barely any time to focus on cloud adoption? Not quite ready to hire a full-time employee to handle it either? Why not partner with Duca, an independent Canadian cloud consulting company? With pay-as-you-go pricing, Duca's AWS experts provide you with the best approach to cloud adoption and respond quickly to your needs so your business runs smooth. Keep your head out of the cloud and focus on your business by booking your free discovery call at duca.ca. That's DIUCA.ca. You mentioned the hypothetical founder in Saskatoon. Shout out Saskatoon. I want to talk a little bit about how your relationship to your clients, to your partner, have changed. Not only on the entrepreneur side, which I think the broad majority of our listeners are most concerned about, because they are entrepreneurs, but then also from the VC side, because you do products for firms here, right? Like not only individual VCs at firms, but helping them, a firm generally spin up as well. Let's start with entrepreneurs first. Have the conversations changed recently? Are they asking for different things? Are they now calling you again saying, hey, we would really love that $10 million top up or that revolving line of credit? We should have paid attention before interest rates went up. And now we think that the slide presentation you gave us last year really makes sense, because as we were saying before, the pressure to put out capital has, I think, gone back to a less manic level. But you have this, the pressure on the businesses hasn't really changed unless they were able to secure financing right before this thing happened. So is there a different type of conversation, or maybe different types of products or structures that you're offering entrepreneurs right now because of this moment in 2022?
So our acquisition was in January 2018. The commitments have grown from $250 million to $8 billion in those 4 years. So we've done a lot of business in Canada, US, and the UK in that time, which is a function of clearly going to market with an offering that was tailored to work for people. And you win some and you listen every day, and that's totally normal. We've grown from 4 offices to 13 and hired a bunch of really talented people, and it's been a lot of fun. Now is going to be a period when entrepreneurs who turned away term sheets last summer and rebuffed financing from new investors. So let's say it's a bootstrap company. They grew to 25 million in revenue without a venture capital round. They were being inbounded, let's say, last summer, and it was a very exciting time both for them and their owners. If they were in burn mode then and they're still in burn mode, it'll be an unhappy period, because whatever the valuation was last summer that was being thrown at them, it'll be much lower today. I don't think that is really different than 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. There will and always will be a disconnect between what somebody thinks their business is worth and what someone's prepared to invest at most of the time, right? For most entrepreneurs. And whether it's 15 times revenue versus 10, whether it's 5 times versus 4 times, whether it's 6 times versus 9, there's always going to be this disconnect that you have to bridge between the investor and the entrepreneur and the founders. So that will be happening again this summer. And you know what? I'll just remind people that Facebook raised venture capital. Google raised venture capital. The entrepreneurs who did that don't look back and regret having done those rounds. And I don't know what the valuations were at that given day, but the point, I think, is what's valid, which is raising capital to help execute your business plan before someone else does down the street or across the world is a good idea. And just because someone offered you 35 million on 200 pre last summer and now they're going to offer you 30 on 100 pre now, well, okay, too bad you didn't take that term sheet then, maybe, but to wait 6 or 12 more months in the hopes market better is prudent if you're able to arrange other sources of capital. Certainly in our case, this is a great time to be an experienced venture lender, because we can fill that gap, right? We can bridge a current round to next year. We can certainly bridge, give somebody the chance to delay that dilution until next year. And that was the case 2 years ago. that isn't different. Our business model, it doesn't change just because it's good times or bad times, because it's never a bad time to finance a good company.
Yeah. Well, so obviously you're talking about like the valuation differences between the last couple of years. I also know, if they had taken that term sheet, they would be dealing with a variety of different stresses being like, how are we,
I
how are
have
we
to
going to
now I have to
facilitate our
now
mission?
live up to that valuation that I have to live up to the valuation that I took last year, and I now need to get my investors. There's now more pressure on me as the founder to deliver against that business plan, and then the economy might have changed, right? So you're absolutely right, and that's the dirty secret, I think, of taking money at a high valuation is you have to hit perfection on your business plan and your retention of your staff, your whatever plans you had to hire to achieve the revenue targets that you marketed against, right? All that's true, and entrepreneurs who don't deliver, all of a sudden find themselves replaced, and through no fault of their own, they didn't deliver. There's a blessing and a curse in some of that stuff for sure.
Yeah, and I don't. We could talk about how that's happened in the public markets with some very long-standing founders in this space. I don't want to dig too much. Like our listeners are familiar with that stuff we covered every day. I want to switch there because there's some things that only you can provide us color on. I want to now talk about, has your relationships with VCs or VC firms changed recently? And maybe it isn't as much because of the downturn, but some of that LP resistance to maybe being deploying capital right now, maybe with what's been going on in real estate, depending upon who your LPs are, they've been being hit in other places and they're like less interested in venture right now. But then also just with what's going on from the government-backed financing of venture in this country with the will they won't they Vicky, whether this is the last VCCI deployment, the fact that the VCCI deployment was delayed by a year. They've announced that it still hasn't gone out. There were a lot of funds circling around that capital, waiting to close or relying upon it, that are still waiting, all in a climate where they're, depending on how long they've been around and how many funds they've raised, their portfolio history is looking pretty marked down right now. Are you having different conversations with, I would say probably not the funds that closed before this, but we're looking to close in this environment, and how, like, are they calling you back, or how is that going?
Look, there are 900 funds in North America. There are a couple of dozen, maybe 30 in Canada of any size. And we've had the luxury of working probably with all of them over the course of the last 4 years and decade or two, and depending upon when they got started. And people move around, and that's good and normal. The fundraising climate this year certainly is tougher than last year just because of the denominator effect, right? If you had a 10% allocation to privates, and of that 10%, a certain amount was for venture, or you had 30 into privates and 25 was to private equity and 5 was to venture or something, and your pension plan assets have shrunk, you just have less money to deploy by the simple math. So that's a problem that's not the VC's fault. The fact that their book might have had been marked down this quarter, it probably was up 100% in the last 2 years. So that's not a problem. If you are coming to market as a first-time fund, that's a problem because there's less money available just because of the denominator effect. Every first-time fund has the same problem, which is getting institutional investors to take a risk on them. And that's in good times and bad times. That's not just a 2022 issue. The Vicky point, look, I was on the board of the CBCA at the time. Did the government relations thing. I wrote the letter to Jim Flaherty in 2008 to get VCAP kicked off. Richard Remillard
Which is
and I met
the
with,
predecessor for Vicky, for people who would be unfamiliar.
Richard Remillard and I met with the Prime Minister of the day, Stephen Harper, and cabinet ministers and every bureaucrat who would take a meeting for years, and the BDC and Tony Clement, who was then the Minister of Industry, were not helpful to getting that VCAP program launched. Eventually, we all succeeded, and it got launched. And you know what? It worked, and it's worked time and time again. And I don't think anybody would disagree with that. And you can change the name, but the strategy is working. And given the state of innovation in our country and the economic growth that we all would like to see, and the transition from old economy to new economy that the population would like to see happen, how any government, any political stripe could stop this modest program based upon the results, I can't imagine. The choice is put that money into something else, right? But that money, what would you put that money into that would be better for the economy and certainly the venture ecosystem and commercializing technologies and whatnot, right? I mean, if Canada spends $20 billion a year on R&D, it's certainly not going to be far from that number. And to spend a few hundred million spend, and when you're investing, of course, on venture funds that then can help professors and academics and entrepreneurs commercialize those technologies, who wouldn't do that? And sure, there's been delays, and invariably bureaucracies don't live up to any of our expectations. But I care about this program surviving, and that's the key thing for us all to put our energy into.
Well, given that, are we sure that there's an issue with it surviving?
No, I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to suggest there was. No,
Okay,
no. I'm saying, as for deployment, I mean, you were saying that there was delay in deployment and and delay in awarding the mandates to the fund of funds folks. I mean, all that has knock-on effects, and I agree with you. We need to highlight those.
So we've been hearing some interesting things in this space, and you had noted it's been very hard for early stage funds, or like I would say maybe both early stage, because usually like less mature firms usually start in the early stage and then move up. I think there's a correlation there. There's a lot of high net worth Shopify people who suddenly were VCs and might be struggling right now. Have you been seeing anything interesting in terms of impacting like the downstream effects on rounds? We've heard there's scuttlebutt in the space as to whether or not there have been some LPs who have not been able to make capital calls for specific firms in Canada related to investments. Is that anything that you're tracking or concerned about?
Well, I'll be generic.
I was hoping you could be specific.
There's certain kinds of investors. We all know what they are. You've got retail investors, friends and family, retail, angels, early stage VC, family office, and mid and later stage VCs, plus the pension plans who have their own strategies, like owners or teachers, and then you've got the corporate VCs who have their own venture arms, like TELUS, for example. Each is going to be different. And a family office, with a multi-billion-dollar set of assets that's in real estate and farming and all sorts of different things. Sure, one day they can decide they just hate this because they had a bad experience or whatever, and stop doing new allocations. But the flip side is any family office looks at the next 50 years and asks themselves, do I think tech and life science will be important? Is going to say yes. So, I think there's certainly some valid reasons to raise money from that cohort for sure. The friends and family, the angels, they have to make decisions based upon their liquidity. That's normal, and that was the case in 2000, and that'll be the case this year. And I've not heard about LPs not being able to fund their pro rata. There's no question in the 20 years I've seen people who thought they had lots of liquidity and then all of a sudden find themselves getting divorced and all of a sudden they can't fund the next round. And you have to be conscious of that as a VC who's got someone at the board table who's writing their own checks, whether that's no matter where that money came from. This is normal. And I think if you are hearing stories like that, I think those are anecdotes that are not rampant.
I think one of the things that we need to note here is like we cover not only at BetaKit, but particularly this podcast, Canadian tech and tech from a Canadian perspective. And one of the reasons why we're interested in speaking with you is because CIBC Innovation Banking Group is pretty active on both sides of the border. You've made a lot of splashy announcements in the last year or so about like hundreds of millions of dollars committed to entrepreneurs and companies on both sides. You're backing a bunch of major U.S. and Canadian funds, and you're deploying capital both sides of the border pretty regularly. I'm just wondering how you're seeing, we talked about the founder in Saskatoon. We talked about this idea of high burn growth at all costs, which I would be considered to be a traditionally U.S. approach to startups that isn't like within the nature of Canadian founders as we all build our B2B SaaS businesses. But then when we talked about the return to sanity a little bit in terms of valuations and deals, seem to be mostly fueled by international funds coming in with an approach that was like, consider Tiger Global, who was coming into the Canadian market and trying to get in every deal over one quarter, and their terms were like a 2-page term sheet with no diligence, no board seat, and they wanted to do the whole thing and just like lock and load, set it and forget it, which was making things a little manic here. I'm wondering if you can calibrate whether or not this course correction on both sides of the border has been a little different. Obviously, we've seen small layoffs here in Canada. We've seen some hiring freezes amongst the major Canadian tech companies. We've had companies like Strategy AI, lay off 90% of their company, but they're still kicking. And then in the US, we've seen like FANG companies terminating employees before their start date, crypto companies setting themselves on fire. I'd say a much more dire course correction, perhaps because of how they were burning and spending. And I'm just wondering how you read it, because you're responsible for and deploying capital on both sides of the border with very different ecosystems.
So I agree they're different ecosystems in a way. If you accept the premise on the mindset point, I've thought it's been one capital market for 20 years. U.S. investors have been investing in Canadian companies for Insight did a deal in Montreal into one of our companies in 2004. So that was a long time ago.
But certainly, like if you track the total funding, it's not like the Canadian investments in Canadian startups increased over the last 2 years. That huge delta that we saw in the ecosystem was from foreign direct investment, right? Whether the U.S. or elsewhere. That was a container holds so much and the cup floweth over, and all that extra capital was looking for a home, and it found Canada.
But it was 40 or 46% was foreign. It wasn't 80. But anyway, I understand the point you're making. I don't think we know yet how. I wouldn't predict right now how next year plays out and what that will mean. I think the layoffs and the right sizing and the reshaping of people's forecasts is a function of expectations about a recession. I think that's universally accepted. Some of these folks haven't done a business plan before into a recession, and obviously COVID was a once in a hundred. Like that wasn't that long ago, right? The pandemic was a once in a 100-year experience, but everybody had it at the same moment. So there's a bit of a free pass, I think, entrepreneurs got because they had to really quickly recalibrate there in that, March and April of 2020. This is different where, sure, there's a recession in certain corners of the economy, and if they are relevant to your business plan, then you sure as heck better make changes. So that makes sense. If you were expecting to raise $25 million next year to carry on in burn mode, and therefore you're going to hire 50 more people this year to go and execute against that plan that meant you would have the revenue that would warrant $75 million round next year. Some of that, certainly you'll see that recalibration because people aren't sure they can raise that 75 next year at any valuation that they could accept or at all. And so that a lot of that I think makes sense. The FANG stuff, these are all big global companies that are obviously have consumer inputs and have to make decisions around what they think is going to happen to GDP and yada yada. So I'm not sure that's as relevant, other than the fact that it creates talent opportunities, right? If Apple was hiring everybody in Waterloo and then they stopped doing that one day, well, then that's good for the other entrepreneurs in Waterloo who get to go and get engineers that otherwise wouldn't have had available.
I think throughout this conversation, you've been pretty even keeled, which I think is probably both maybe reassuring to founders, and then also like, well, yes, he works at CIBC. That's very helpful for him.
Well, but I've got a paycheck, but so what? I'm at the point in my career where there's no downside to being frank and honest, just like there wasn't 20 years ago.
Yeah.
If you think this is a bad time to raise money, you weren't around in the summer 2000 or 2009. Okay, that's the first takeaway. The second takeaway is if you feel there aren't very many doors to knock on, there are still 900 funds in North America and family offices looking for you. If you can't raise money, don't blame the market. And that's the thing. Good companies can raise money. If you don't like 10 times revenue, you want 15, well, I'm sorry. There was a time when 1 times revenue was a good number. So entrepreneurs have lots of reasons to be proud, and certainly valuation is a function of pride. But ultimately, succeeding on your business plan is what's important. And 2/3 of a loaf this year is, there's no shame in 2/3 of a loaf.
Still tastes great. Throughout this conversation, you've been displaying that kind of frankness and honesty. And I need to ask you this question because I got my start as a blogger. So I have a special place in my heart for the practice. I heard a rumor that the reason that CIBC wanted to acquire Wellington Financial is that everyone was reading your blog in the space because this would have been, for the most part, predominantly pre-Beta Kit, really, or at least pre-Beta Kit's focus on Canadian startups. And they were like, this is a great blog. We need to bring this guy in. Is that rumor true? Did CIBC acquire Wellington Financial because you are an excellent blogger?
No. Thank you for the compliment, I suppose. But look, Rick Siegel had a blog when he was at JLI Ventures. He says, you like to write. It's a great way to meet people and talk about things that matter to you. And so I started, and it went on for 10 years. And there's not a more thankless task than blogging, I can tell you.
I agree.
It's scary when you're at Starbucks and a pension plan chief investment officer says, hey, I know you. I read your stuff. You, oh, shit. And so the problem with blogging is that when you find out that people like that read it, you have to up your game the next day. And so you got to do more proprietary research, and you've got to go after stuff that nobody else will go after if there's reason to talk about it. And nothing good comes of blogging as a venture capitalist unless it's all rah-rah all the time, right? But if you are taking on sacred cows, you get in shit. And people like the CEO of a pension plan might badmouth you because you've been talking about their plan's approach to venture in a way that they didn't find complementary. And as one VC, a very senior VC, said to me, I love it. You say what I can't say. And, I guess that's good. But golly, it's dangerous territory if you can't handle it. The wonderful thing about blogging is that there's a way to advocate on public policy issues for our ecosystem with people like, when Glenn Murray, the provincial Ontario minister, Liberal minister of innovation, was thinking about the Ontario Venture Fund and the MRI Fund, I was, I guess, observing on the topics and not in a positive way. And he emails me to say, come and see me. And don't tell my staff you're coming. Don't tell the deputy minister I'm coming. Why don't you come and talk about our sector? And he and I became friends through that process. And we helped, the CBCA and helped guide, Liberal. Here I was a former Conservative staffer, and here was a Liberal minister. When we found common cause, and that all came together because of the blog. So lots of really good things can come from it. You talk about companies that matter to you and your team, and during the financial crisis, explaining what was going on. When certain T-bill funds in Europe broke the dollar mark, talking about that. And what we were seeing certainly was relevant to folks at the time, and a lot of journals or whatever would follow it, and then go off and do a magazine cover on Kevin O'Leary because of the research you'd done on his questionable investment track record. And I guess all that's good, but when you're at a bank and there's 13 million customers and you don't know who the 13 million customers are, it's not fair to anybody to try and write a blog. And if it's not interesting, no one should read it. And for it to be interesting means you're going to have to tackle stuff that it's not fair to anybody, an institution, just because there are 13 million customers. And it's not for me to be traipsing into that kind of stuff. So you know what? It was fun, and sometimes in life you declare a victory and you drive on. That the New York Times once called it widely read on Bay Street, I guess, was a great way to you jumped the shark. And the fact that a few VCs that you and I know want me to take it up again to help advocate for them because they won't do it themselves shouldn't surprise anybody. And I take that as both a compliment and shame on them. They should pick up their own virtual pens and go at it.
I agree. Shame on them.
I'll help them. I might even ghost one for them without ever admitting to.
Well, I was going to say to close this off, sir, if it ever you feel the inclination to stretch your fingers at any point in time, I happen to run what some people might describe as a blog that is fairly widely read on Bay Street. So pseudonym or otherwise, ghostwritten or not, let me extend that offer to you. And then if not, we would love to have you back on the podcast.
I've kept up Twitter, Mark R. McQueen on Twitter. So that's a poor man's blog, as we both know. An easy way of doing opinion riffing, but it's not the same thing as getting into stuff in depth that helps teach people about the sector. And
sir, if we're gonna talk about your Twitter account, we're gonna need a whole second episode. The Baitikit podcast is produced by Baitikit Incorporated. It's edited by Katie Lohr, and its hosts are Rob Kennedy and me, Douglas Saltus. To learn more about how you can support this podcast, head to patreon.com/Baitikit.